Good morning, and Fred Hanukkah, and welcome back. We are reviewing the conclusion of Hemshech Ayin Beis. We're on page 1422 in this review. And to sum up, it's explaining, he began to explain the avodah of this highest level of unity, of the divine unity, the higher levels, all levels, I should say, in Kol HaMayrich Be'echad, one who extends, and he's explaining extending meaning the contemplation on Echad by looking at existence, which is a multitude of details, a structure, and extrapolating basically that it all is really driven by the divine speech, the Esis HaDibur, which in turn comes from divine thought, and in turn all the way up to Shmei HaGadol, which is the very concept of expression that God chose to allow himself to be expressed in order for existence to be. So we've been elaborating all these levels, slowly abstracting deeper and deeper all the way back to the divine unity in the highest possible level, and explaining that that unity needs to be experienced by us down below. But this, of course, is a step-by-step process. You can't just jump to the highest levels without first going step by step in a way that we could integrate and internalize it. That's in general terms what we've been learning. This began, the Ma'ir Be'echad began on page 1417, which in turn followed to explain Kol Ha'oinu Amin Yesh Me'rabba B'chol Koichei. The Amin Yesh Me'rabba, which we didn't get back to yet, we will. The Shmei Rabba, great name, Shmei Rabba, Shmei HaGadol. And that is Kedin L'Gzar Din. It has the power to transform even the Gvuris, even the negative forces, because you're reaching to Primius Atik, or less smaller Bahayatika, like we learned earlier. That in turn was coming after the explanation of who. There's who and there's Ata. There's the divine as it relates to existence, and who is more of the unknown, the third person. And who itself, there's the level of who as in Sevav Kalaman, and then there's who, as we learned, all the way up to Atzmus, which is the Tov, Chadu, the Tov Mekulu, that's higher than the other who, the 5 levels of who, positive and negative, as we learned that earlier as well. And this goes back to pages 1413 and on. But really the topic began essentially on page 1411, where he started talking about the 3 levels of Ava. And which we're going to return to soon as he completes the whole picture. Just giving you a little lay of the land, the whole structure. And that in turn followed Ishin Einai, that the Jewish people, the Neshamis, are called the pupil of the eye, which is higher than just the eyes, which relate to existence. The Einei Ha'eda, the leaders, the Skenim, the Malachim, that already are related to existence, the middays that connect the eye in 70, the 70 or the 7 eyes, or the 70 Sanhedrin, which is already 10 times 7, the middays that relate to existence. And then there's Moshe, Mufla Mekolish, the highest level, going back again to Atik. So, and this of course comes as we're discussing Torah and Neshamas Yisrael as the bigger picture, that Neshamas, as they come down below, they're concealed, but using Torah, the light of Torah, guides them and helps elevate them and helps the Neshamas do their job to ultimately experience bringing a godliness into this world through the Achdus that we're talking about, Hamayich Be'echad. But ultimately we'll learn how the Neshamas actually are mashpia into Torah, because in their root, they're rooted even higher than Torah, in the Helam Ha'atzmi, in the Shmei HaGadol that we're talking about here. So to bring it back to where we are now, on page 1421, after explaining what Shmei is in the highest levels, the 10 hidden spheres are the Shemei Shlosh Rabim. Shmei HaGadol is one, and even higher than that, Shmei HaKol Batz Musei, the way it's called Batz Musei, that is the highest level. So that's when he returned and said, this is what the contemplation is about, to take existence and draw it back all the way to its source. But first, Esis HaDibur, as I said, Machshava, the Keiches, the godly attributes, And then the hidden attributes in Keser, the Skrichas and Alom, as he called them, Keser, Arich, and Atik, and all the way to before the Tzimtzum, the Esesfiris Agnuzis, and then to Shmei HaGadol, and all the way to Yechelis, as the Shmei's Kol Batz Museh. And all that is part of the contemplation of Amayrik Be'echad. Now, what we also learned, just to sum up, is that the higher you go, the more the Oisius themselves become more, either more sublime, to the point you can't even recognize them, or they haven't yet taken shape, as we learned that as well. Like, for example, in Chachma, compared to Bina, the letters are not yet, they're not yet shaped, it's only a flash, a spark of an idea. In Bina, the letters, the Kalim, become more prominent. Mostly prominent they are in Dibur, when the person speaks, where you actually can sense letters, that's Malchus. So we're, as I said, we're traveling from the letters of Asius as they go back to their source, all the way back into the Etzem HaNefesh is the example Lamata, and Lamaila, that's all the way the Asius as they are before the Tzimtzum. So, what's the last thing we learned? The last thing we learned at the bottom of page was 1421 was exactly this point, that the Kalim take on more shape and become more broken down and more separated as you go down lower. As you go higher, the Kalim become less and the Eiris become more dominant. That's what we learned on top of this page, 1422, and therefore it's a deeper bitl and achdus, just like in Atzilus. We spoke the difference between Atzilus and higher than Atzilus. That in Atzilus you say Ir v'gamu echad, the Kalim are also one with God. However, you say Ir v'gamu echad, Ir v'chayu echad, Ir v'gamu echad, there's two levels of chad. So it's not a complete seamless unity, is the Kalim are also recognized and completely feel their godly nature. Whereas in Bria, they don't. But nevertheless, it's Achdus, but it's still two times Chad. So there's a difference. But in Keser, lo yesh chiluk ben chayu legamui. In Keser, there's no difference between the Eiris and the Kalim. Also, the Kalim are meyuchid like the Eir. Because the Kalim are not a separate mahus, like letters that are engraved, in contrast to letters that are written. Written letters are also one with a parchment, but not completely one. You could separate them because they're two separate elements. Whereas the engraved letters are part of the very etzem, what they're engraved in, the stone they're engraved in. Then he explained that we also find in the spheres, not necessarily in Keser, in the spheres you also find an example of a level where the Keli is like the Eir. So you see here how every level is interfacing as much as possible. And where's that? The sphere called Tiferes. So in Tiferes we know the Keli, Avaya, Hadiyakeli Kamoya Eir. And he explained in the parentheses, and I think that's where we reached. Let me see. Did we finish to the end of the paragraph? Yeah, I think we ended.
We finished
we
to
went
the
to
end.
the end of the paragraph. So in the parentheses, he explained that the key, the distinction is this: the keli husha it atzmi nasa bechinas keli lias nitfus. You could have a keli, like we say in a neshama and a guf, for example, a soul and a body. The body is not created by the soul. The body is actually shaped by the father and the mother, and it's the neshama that comes from Hashem. But on a higher level, the kelim themselves emerge from the oir, like he says here. Nas bechinas keli is nitfus, which means that the oir is taking on more definition. So therefore, that's what he says. Nas bechinas keli. And he explained it before with Shema. I said I would look that up. I didn't have a chance to look it up, so that we'll get back to. And the dugma lezek when Hashem Hashem ben biyah and b'chinas halakus mamish. The Shagam b'biyah rather. The Hashem is the higher neshamas. Even when they come down to biyah, like I gave the example with Moshe Rabbeinu, they retain their divine atzilus nature, and that's why there's a difference between neshamas and malachim. And I think it was posted on the group how I explained this, how I taught this in the last time we learned it, originally when we learned it. And also, Primius Abba, Primius Atik, that even though we say the Primius of Chacham is Primius Atik, it's still not exactly the same level. So there Primius Atik Mamish. But nevertheless, what makes it Primius Abba? Because then it becomes in a form of Tfisa, Al Yadei Leisas, which is like a negative, through, like we said, there's like chiyuv, a mitzvah, and then there's leisasa. That's the parentheses that we learned. Again, I'm just summing it all up. Just to put this on. And then after the parentheses, so that's in Teferis. And I explained that length in the previous class. Why is he coming to emphasize that? Because he wants to show, remember the Achdus, wherever possible, we're trying to unite things instead of separating them. So even in the Spheres Hagluyas, meaning in the Keches Pnimim of Atzilus, you also find Teferis a deeper unity than the other spheres. But nevertheless, it's even more so in the level of Keser, where the Keli is like the Ur, for Kol Shula Ma'il Madrega, and again, the higher you go, and the Gilui Ur is on a higher level, and it's in a higher revelation and a higher level, the more you have the Achdus HaKelim. So in other words, the further down you go, the more separation happens. And I gave the example of a seed, of the fetus, as it is right at the moment of conception. So that's the way the process works, and it makes and the way we see all our systems work that way. Everything works from klal to prat. It starts a unified singularity, and then it breaks down as it goes downward. Then he finally said that also lifnei tzimtzum, you also have al derech eris and kelim, not actually eris and kelim, obviously, because there everything is conceptual and everything there is more in potential. And he brought from the Pardes that the 10 hidden spheres are the roots of the kelim. So just like the 10 spheres in Atzilus, there's the Atzmus HaMispashid Behem. The Atzmus here means the Ur that manifests. This is a language from the Pardes calls Ur Atzmus. So Atzmus simply means the core, versus kelim, which is more the manifestation. So that's not to be confused with the Atzmus that we usually talk about, Atzmus Ein Sof. Says Atzmus Pashba, there's now, you can't compare the two. That's why he said by you can say, by kelim you can say they have roots, but the you can't say that they have roots. Now this is all on the level of Aleisa Ratzin before the Tzimtzum, where your level of Shemus, like we said, Shemus is a number of names, not one name, several names. That means there's already a distinction, relatively speaking, before the Tzimtzum, as God is conceiving and God is envisioning existence, or envisioning the 10 hidden spheres, so to speak. Okay, that's Atzilus the Klolos. But higher than Aleisa Ratzin, it becomes a Shem Echad. So here again, you see Shemus Lashon Rabim. Go deeper, higher up. It's one Shem, one expression, which then breaks down into several expressions. And there's no Shosh HaKel B'Shosh HaEris, and nevertheless, it's still not Atzmus, it's Hamshachim in Atzmus, because it's God choosing to express himself, to say that I will be expressed. But even higher than that, even than the Shemay Echad, is Shem HaKol B'Atzmusei. There is completely Ba'achdus B'Atzmusei is Baruch. And yet, that's also not Atzmus. It's just that it's one with Atzmus. Hu Shmoi v'Shmoi Hu, because there it's the Yechelis Atzmus to express himself, as we learned. So it's still not Atzmus Mamish, meaning because the Leize Iker Elikus, like he said in the previous page, it's called Madrega Tachtena in Atzmus, because that's not the Iker of Elikus to express himself, but it's the power of expression that he has within the Etzem. So there you have all the levels as we go all the way down into existence. And we draw it back to higher levels. Now, what really causes, therefore, to be this gradation? So we learned earlier, if you recall, that it's all due to the Tzimtzumim. That's how he began the topic when he started speaking about Oisius Hadibur. I'm sorry, but he started speaking, let's see here. When he started speaking that the Achdus of within the highest levels in Atzmus is also the same Achdus in Dibur, so he says V'yuven zeh memoshla hanal, and he goes back to Esis Dibur, and he says the reason that is Sibus Hadover and Pnei Shaher Sham Tzumtzum. In other words, there's one more thing we need to discuss, because in reality, how could you say that the Achdus in the lower levels of the Kelim, as they come down below, is the same level as unity all the way before the Tzimtzum, all the way in the Shmei Kol B'Atzmusei? Because remember, the only reason there's distinction of Kelim is because of the Tzimtzumim. And the Gaba Asmas, the Tzimtzumim don't have any effect. It's only for us. So in other words, our work is to eliminate and see through the concealments. And that's what he's going to explain now, because that's one more point that needs to be made. In Tanya, he makes it as well in chapter 21. 21 and 22, but primarily 21, that is, even though there is dibur and God is speaking, he rakia, so there clearly, even in God's speech, there is distinction between light and rakia and heaven. And the same with the other Asarim Mamoris, the 10 statements that God made. And yet, because it originates from the Achdus above, and it's only due to the Tzimtzumim that there's these distinctions, so now one more point has to be made, that the Tzimtzumim, and this is all part of the Ma'arich Be'echad, this is also part of the contemplation. Besides contemplating, in addition to contemplating how the letters, as they vivify and they sustain, they create and sustain existence, are rooted all the way in the letters as they are in their potential state, all the way before the Tzimtzum, all the way into Atzmus. As another point, another part of the contemplation is that the Tzimtzumim that affect and cause these distinctions, that make us feel and experience separation and diversity, is due to Tzimtzumim, and those Tzimtzumim are not affecting Atzmus. So our job is, number one, is to trace it all the way back to the Etzem, but also to trace it back in a way where the Tzimtzumim don't have impact. So it's even more work to be done here, because we do live in a post-Tzimtzum reality. So that's what he's going to discuss now, the contemplation part about how Tzimtzumim are only from our point of view, not from God's point of view. Like a teacher, when he teaches, even though he's teaching in a condensed form and he's spoon-feeding the students with Ayin Beis, those letters, like letters of Dibur, but for him, the concealment of hiding the profound oir within those kelim doesn't have an effect. It's only because that's the way he's communicating to the students. So that's what we're going to learn now, the new paragraph on page 1422. Okay. So the pages can be found at ayinbeis.com, page 1422, the new paragraph. Hine Yedua, and now it's known. The Cholat Tzimtzumim, all the concealments, meaning all the concealments that create this diversity. Because like we said, in order for the kelim to manifest and start really breaking down and creating structure, you have to conceal the oir. And the more you conceal the oir, the more the kelim manifests. So he says, all these tzimtzumim, all these concealments, they're only from the perspective of our perspective. That doesn't mean they're false. That does not mean an illusion. Like he explains in Shari Yichud V'Amunah, and here as well in Ayin Beis, in Tanya, that it's like Shemesh Shemagan Hashem Elikim, because the Tzimtzumim themselves are Nikra Kelim, are God's power to conceal. That's a real power. It's just that for God, it's not a concealment. For us, it's a concealment. But the very Tzimtzum is a divine power. And therefore, it's a real name, Shem Elikim, and it does conceal. However, the concealment is not from God's point of view, because it's just another power of God. Just as God has the power to reveal, he has the power to conceal. And as we've learned, his power to reveal is not necessarily greater than his power to conceal. It's just two yechelis. It's all one within Atzmos. So the distinction is only after there's the expression that it comes into the Ur, and then there's the Ur that reveals, and there's the power to conceal. Compared to Eid Ein Sof, from perspective of Eid Ein Sof, there's no tzimtzum, there's no concealment, and there's no diminishment and concealment at all. And the Eid Ein Sof radiates, revealed after the tzimtzum, just like before the tzimtzum. But because there is a tzimtzum, so we only see a diminished experience of it. But within that diminished oir lies everything, from God's perspective, lies everything that's there before the tzimtzum. Because after all the tzimtzumim, nimshach hashpos al kiz be'elam lahachiz kol nivra v'nivra. Because with all the tzimtzumim, he's bringing one of the explanations is because if the tzimtzumim also impacted above, so to speak, in other words, godliness is also concealed in the higher levels, then how is God creating existence? So he says, because after all the tzimtzumim, nimshach hashpah lekiz be'elam lahachiz kol nivra v'nivra. So we see after all the Tzimtzumim, it's not just a concealment and the earth is not shining. It's a kav. It's true. It's now a kav. The kav has a structure. It has a hierarchy. But the kav is carrying divine power and divine light to create every nivra, every separate creation. So that alone tells you it's not mamash a hester, tzimtzum and hester, because if it was a real tzimtzum and hester, there should be nothing afterwards. It would be like a black hole, period. Concealment. But we know that after the tzimtzum comes the kav, and that means divine energy is flowing in a diminished way. But you can't say tzimtzum hester mamash. Now, why is the Rebbe Rasha bringing that? Why doesn't he just state to the fact that from God's point of view, like the teacher, even when the energy comes in a more structured way, for him it has no impact because he remains completely in his, like the teacher, and his brilliance has not been diminished. It's just not flowing into the students. In this case, into existence. But it looks like he wants to go even further and say the very process of existence, which is coming from divine energy, means it's not subject completely to tzimtzum from God's point of view. So there's like two aspects to the kav. The kav, let's talk like the students. In other words, the students are getting two things. They're getting a diminished flow so they can understand what's being said without becoming obliterated and overwhelmed. But within that intelligence that's flowing to them, that stream of consciousness, lies all the depth of the teacher, except they don't see it yet. That's why you say, in other places, other Maimorim, it brings in Samachvov, in other places, that 40 years, until 40 years, a student doesn't fully appreciate the teacher, but then he does. Why? How is that possible? If it was given to him in a diminished way, how from a diminished place has he come to has he arrived to understand the teacher in the full glory? Because that was all packaged and concentrated in the information that he received. Except now he can only hear Ayin Beis, or whatever level the student is at. So he's pointing out here, therefore, that in the process of creation lies all this deeper energy. And that itself tells you that the Ein Tzimtzum Hester Mamish. Let me stop if anybody wants to ask anything, and then we'll continue the next section here. So now he brings something which was, we had learned this earlier at the end of volume 2. Maybe some of you may remember. It's a while back. So he brings a Gemara. The Gemara talks about a min, an apokris, an apostate, and who was suggesting that there are two, that there's God that created existence. However, existence is separate from God. In other words, it's called shtei reshuyos is the expression. It's like two different properties, two different domains. Obviously, Hashem Echad tells us that's not the case, that there's only one reality, and the God, as he is in his purest form, is also here below. So this is now he's bringing this Gemara to substantiate to substantiate what he just said about unity, that the unity, that the divine is not subject to Tzimtzumim, even though from our point of view, you could say there's a difference between heaven and earth. You could say Shemayim LaHashem va'aretz libnei Adam, that heaven was given to is the Hashem, and earth was given to man. So he's going to explain that that's not the case. That even on earth you have the same unity of the divine. So the min So there were two kings. They're using a mashal of two kings. One was called Hurmiz, and one was called Ahurmiz. I know it's a similar name, but one has an aleph. And basically the min is saying to say from the top half. So let's say think of a piece of land, a country. The top half of the country belongs to Hurmiz, mepalgacha means half, and the lower half is the Ahurmiz. The min, this denier of God's divine unity, is basically defining existence with and the divine in a form of duality. As if they're two domains. One domain that belongs to one king, another domain belongs to another king. What's the reason for his argument? Because he's defining the tzimtzum as a true tzimtzum. So therefore, in a sense, God created existence and removed himself from there. And there isn't a seamless unity. Chaz v'shalom. The Amalei and the Tana there responded to him, Heich shavik ahurmiz lahurmiz lavura maya ba'are. So then how does ahurmiz to hurmiz, how does he needs water, and the water is coming from the higher part of the country to the lower part. How is that happening if they're two separate reshuyas? That's how he responds. That you can't say that it's a absolute split between the two, even though you could say it's two domains in the sense there are two kings that rule, but there's definitely a connection between them. From the fact that water is transmitted, that water flows from one to the other. So the Rebbe Rashab Chassidus explains the story in a primistic way, that the difference between them, one was saying, the min was saying there is a separation, that means that tzimtzum is a real tzimtzum even from the point of view of godliness. And he's responding, no, this is a chachak gemura, the enat tzimtzum amiti, dimkein lo yoyeshum ashpa klal. Because if there was real tzimtzum amiti, there should be no flow going from one to the next. The fact that there's a flow going from one to the other means that there really is no split between the two. And this is what he's bringing the proof. The fact that even after the tzimtzum, the Eir Eliki manifests inside of existence and creates existence has to tell you that there is a connection between the two. And being that there's hashpahs coming from godliness into existence, that means that tzimtzum is not an airtight concealment, because if it was airtight, it could not flow. So the tzimtzum is in a manner that's not completely covered up. And though it's coming in a more diminished flow, nevertheless, the tzimtzum does not stop that flow. The flow continues. Why is that the case? Why is that the case? Why can't you say that tzimtzum is a separate type of, changes the structure? So he says, because the tzimtzum is not a separate entity. Going back to that example, if someone came, let's say a human force came and said, okay, I'm going to separate between ahurmiz and ahurmiz, and I'm going to allow water to go from one to the other, that would be an outside entity. But tzimtzum itself, he says, is not a dover achar. Like I explained before. Who's creating the tzimtzum? The same teacher who's teaching the ideas is also the one that's creating the tzimtzum. So the tzimtzum is not coming from an outside force. It's another force of God. It's another godly force. Indeed, you are the keil mistater, the one that conceals himself. In other words, it's not another force that's concealing God. It's God himself is employing one of his attributes or one of his strengths, the power to conceal. So therefore, the tzimtzum hester doesn't have a life of its own. You can't just say, hey, you know what, here's something entered that as a life of its own, now it's two separate entities. The tzimtzum itself, it's basically only following the desire of the mitzamtzum, and whatever he wants, that tzimtzum to serve the role, to allow the flow, to allow existence to be an independent consciousness. So the very tzimtzum itself is a divine force. So just as God has the power to reveal, he has also the power to channel what he reveals, or to direct it, or to focus it, or even to diminish it. So based on this, therefore, you may understand that it doesn't conceal at all, being that it's a divine power. The Meshumzeh ain't a Hester Gomer. And that's why what we said before, it's not a Hester Gomer. It's not a complete concealment. It's not an airtight concealment. Hari etzem ain't a master al etzem. So this is a rule that you find in a number of Maimorim Chassidus. This is actually a halachic statement. Etzem is not mastered on etzem. Something, a very essence, cannot conceal itself. One thing can conceal another thing. Like for example, you take an object, let's say water, and you want to build a dam. The dam, you're building the dam. It's not part of the creator that's building the water. It's not the same coming from the same place as the water. But etzem, since the power to reveal and the power to conceal are both coming from the etzem ain't master el etzem. This is also brought in the famous Maimer V'yadaita Moskva. It's called V'yadaita Tofresh Nun Zayin. I believe there he brings the halacha. He doesn't bring it here. Why you can't if you need two coverings on your head. Let's say you want a yarmulke. Why can't you just put your hand on top of your head and serve as a yarmulke? Why do we need a separate entity? The answer is because ein etzem master el etzem. Your hand is part of who you are. The idea of a yarmulke is to have an element, an object that's not part of who you, that is recognizing that there's a God beyond us and above us. So it says this is what's brought. That's why a hand ein etzem master el etzem. That's one halachic example brought. It's a minig regarding a yarmulke, but the same idea. So it says ein etzem master el etzem, since the power to reveal, the power of Tzimtzum is coming from the same power, is coming from the same entity that reveals. Ein etzem master el etzem, doesn't conceal. Umeir be'emes b'chinas atzmus ein sof begili mamish la'achrat Tzimtzum k'mei kedem Tzimtzum. So therefore, in truth, the core of Ein Sof radiates literally in a revealed way after the Tzimtzum, just as kedem Tzimtzum. So then, what is the power of Tzimtzum? L'gabe the makablim, the recipients, meaning us. We only see what we're shown. And especially when you know that, according to Chassidus Chabad, Tzimtzum is not kipshutei, that means even though we look around and we see a world and we don't see the divine energy within it, but that's the whole point of this contemplation, that's only from our perspective. The truth is the divine energy is here completely in the fullest sense of the word, because the Koyach HaTzimtzum is coming from the same place as the Koyach HaGilui, meaning from the same God, and therefore it radiates K'may Kedem HaTzimtzum mamish, like Achrat Tzimtzum, like K'may Kedem HaTzimtzum. Now I have to point out a very important point here. This is very much connected to the very central theme that began in volume 2 in Ayin Beis, where he asked the big question: how is it possible for us to have total unity with the divine pre-Tzimtzum when all of existence is predicated on the Tzimtzum? So it's important to note this is not a side point here. This is like critical to the whole theme of volume 2. Now, obviously, we're going to learn more about this, but this is the whole point of the interface of what Ayin Beis explains, the interface between divine and existence. Here, the emphasis is that unity, even in the highest levels, can be experienced also in the lowest levels. That's ultimately where he's going with this. But in volume 2, he already established that Tzimtzum is only b'shvil hagili. The whole Tzimtzum is in order to reveal, and therefore, and also revelation before the Tzimtzum is in order to shine through the Tzimtzum. So it's all part of the plan, like he said, k'fi rotzon hamitzamtzum. It's all according to God's plan. So therefore, if you think about it, in the contemplation of Amayich Be'echad, the Tzimtzum itself is also part of the unity of the divine. So it sounds paradoxical. The Tzimtzum creates the concealment that makes us think that we don't see unity, like the min that said that there's two separate domains. But then when you contemplate, you come to realize the whole Tzimtzum is also part of the divine picture. It's also part of the divine plan. And then you realize that the concealment itself is part of the unity as well. So let me stop here. He's going to give an example, a human example for this, but let me stop if anybody wants to ask anything.
So you're saying that there is a channel that's left open? Is that what you're saying? That there is this channel that we have
a lot of points that were said here. That's one point.
Yeah, but that we're not aware of it, and the contemplation is for us to start to become aware that there's a channel that we can climb up this channel to get to the ultimate unity.
Absolutely. And furthermore, not just a channel. we can get to the place that's beyond the channel also. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
The best example, instead of it shouldn't be too abstract, is think of the student and the teacher. A student that, as he grows, he becomes more and more familiar with the teacher's ideas to the point that he can literally bond with how the teacher understands the idea. Even though initially he was a 5-year-old that just received Ayin Beis, ABC. But as he grows and his channels expand, what happens? He could become just as bright as the teacher, and even furthermore surpass the teacher. Like we said, like I mentioned, 40 years, he actually appreciates the teacher. How is that possible? The answer is precisely because the Tzimtzum was only a tool to reveal. It wasn't a tool to conceal. It conceals in order to reveal, if you want to put it that way. Basically, it's the way to, how do you communicate to an existence that is, at this point, initially, does not yet appreciate godliness in the fullest sense of the word. The only way is through a tzimtzum, or else you don't have tachtenim, you don't have existence. But it's not an airtight situation where you come and you hit a glass ceiling. You actually can travel all the way back to before the tzimtzum, all the way back to these highest levels. But it takes this contemplation, number one, that they all are rooted one higher than the other. Number two, that the kelim become more and more abstract and they lose their identity as they become absorbed in the Oir. And finally, that the Tzimtzumim don't have any impact on the Oir Ein Sof itself before the Tzimtzum. The impact is only from the recipient's point of view. So that's all part of this contemplation, as we shall learn. But that's the next point. That's the point that we learn now. Yeah.
Rabbi, you actually just alluded to it in what you just said, that the Makabel doesn't feel him or herself in contemplating Atzmus. That's in order to contemplate Atzmus, the Makabel should not feel themselves, which is essentially.
I didn't say that. Now I said it in another class, not now. I didn't say that right now.
Well, I'm just saying. You said what you said in a prior class. You said it just now. Anyways, my question is, what that's referring to Bittul, obviously, but I'm wondering why the Rabbi Rashab in this sugya, this segment here, why he doesn't talk about Bittul, because that seems fundamental to.
It's all part of one flow. It's all part of the flow. You can't say it all the time. You have to go back. It's one long flow here. I spoke about it before, and I'm explaining the Ma'arich Be'echad. He's not even saying Ma'arich Be'echad here.
Yeah, true. Okay, I see your point. He's just talking about how the Tzimtzum, how the Atzmus.
Right now, he's talking about how the Tzimtzum doesn't have an impact.
Yeah.
I added, just to give it context, that ultimately, when we contemplate on that, we come to realize those levels. And as we do, we go higher and higher.
Yes. Where did he talk about Bittul?
He's going to go back to that in the next page. On Ma'arich Be'echad, on page 1423, the next paragraph. He's going to come back to what the contemplation consists of, summing it all up. Right now, it's a bunch of different pieces of it all.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Okay. So now he continues and says this idea, to help us contemplate on it, he gives us now an example from the human faculties. The Zem moving gamkein mekeiches hanefesh. So remember, what's the gamkein? Because before we used the keiches hanefesh, remember human speech and thought and primius haseichel, bina, chachma. We used human lamata to understand what oisius are, kelim, and how they become more and more abstract and more dissolved, if you wish, as they become absorbed in the Oir on higher levels. So he says this point about Tzimtzum, we also can understand from Keiches HaNefesh, from human faculties. And this is critical because, as I said, all these ideas, if you don't have something you can hold on to that we relate to, it becomes very abstract and just very technical. So Keiches HaNefesh, what do we see? Kamei b'hashpa'as haseichel. So I already jumped the gun. I already gave the example of a teacher, but he's going to now say it explicitly. Like an hashpa'ah of seichel. When seichel is transmitted from one to another, In order to transmit an idea to another, the teacher he must conceal the Eira Seichel from the way it is by himself. Because if he just opens up his mouth and just pours out everything he knows, I mean, we're not talking about someone on his level. We're talking about a student, especially a beginner student. The person, the Makabel will not be able to receive it. Be like Reif Teva, Eni Yechem Makabel. The Gemara uses that as an example. Imagine the rain coming down in buckets instead of raindrops. It'll flood the fields. In this context, it'll overwhelm the student and can even and confuse the student, actually. So it's behechlet that he has to conceal the Eira Seichel. So as he applies those breaks, so to speak, as he applies that restraint that's necessary for a teacher to teach the student. What he's doing is nimtza Eira Seichel hashaychel makabel. So from the seichel as it is by him, he's now so-called extracted or drawn out a seichel that relates to the student. And that's really what defines a good teacher and the difference between an excellent teacher and not an excellent teacher. You'll see people who are geniuses and they give a lecture and a talk and it just comes flowing like a genius. So maybe we're all impressed by the genius, but it's not necessarily containable. They don't know how to contain and control the flow. The real secret is transmitting it like laser energy, focusing. Yes, it should contain a lot of information, but in a way that the student, the recipient, can receive it. Now, in this mashal, this tzimtzum that the teacher applied, this restraint or refrain that he applied, is only from the point of view of the makabel. He's not changed. The teacher has not stopped understanding the idea the way he understood it before he taught his student. The student is not aware of the depth and the inner intelligence within the idea that's being conveyed to him. Next page, 1423. But from the perspective of the mashpia, the teacher in this case, ain't a master klal. This concealment that he's applying does not conceal at all. Because within him, unbeknownst to the student, but to the teacher, radiates the depth and the pnimius of the seichel. And the inner dimension, the student is only getting a certain dimension of it, but not the entire thing. But from the teacher's point of view, the Tzimtzum is not mastered at all. And furthermore, the gam, but you could say, you know what, but when he's teaching the student, for that moment, the teacher is applying himself to the student, and then he loses sight of that dinner. He says, no, the gam b'masha mashpia lemakabel. Not just he remains intact in his own mind, but even when he's mashpia, but in what he's teaching the student, even the very few words or the diminished seichel that is being conveyed to the makabel, to the recipient, hu roya kol hapnimius. The teacher continues to see all the pnimius there. Like I gave the example with the Aleph. Friedrich Rebbe says that the Aleph of Anochi in the Ten Commandments encompasses word Anochi, which encompasses the first of the two commandments, which encompasses the entire Ten Commandments, which encompasses, as the Rasak says, all the Torah mitzvahs. When you teach an Aleph to a child, they don't see all that. They see an Aleph. The teacher knows very well that that Aleph has all of it. Even when he's saying Aleph, Kametz Aleph, he knows all that depth. He's not explaining it. And he's not right now necessarily consciously reviewing all of that, but he's fully aware of it. So the Tzimtzum is not just that he remains in his own mind completely untouched by the Tzimtzum, but even as he's saying the Aleph, even as he's conveying the idea, the Pnimius, he sees all the Pnimius within it. So then the question is, does the Tzimtzum have any effect on the teacher? So he says down the parentheses, Upulas Tzimtzum legaba mashpia. The function of the Tzimtzum from the point of view of the mashpia is Yisha Pnimis Einam Mevatel, the Einam Mevalbla Sachitzenius. So yes, he says that Tzimtzum also has an effect that because if the Pnimius was radiating in full glory, let's take for a moment before he's teaching the student. The teacher is studying a text, and he's studying it with his full brilliance. So then, that part of the seichel, the chitzenius of it, that he would teach the student, is completely part of and completely absorbed within the premise of the seichel. So if he if a student was able to listen in to the teacher as he's learning on his own, he would not understand it. So that's what he's saying. So what does the tzimtzum do? The tzimtzum causes, even by the mashpia, that all that brilliance should not overwhelm the idea that he's teaching to the students, so he's able, and it's not meval with the chitzenius. So there is an effect of the tzimtzum on him. But as you see, it's only an effect in order to transmit. It's not an effect to conceal in any way. Like we learned earlier in the Maimer Shleisha Dvarim, which was in volume 2, as he says, page 10, what was it? 1010. It's 1010, basically. Okay, that's Ashpa on him. The Im Kain, so 1 sec. So Im Kain, Meir Erein Sof, Begil Lachrat Tzimtzum Kamei Kedem Tzimtzum. So in this example, we see clearly that now he's going back to the nimshal because he's using the word Erein Sof. So the Erein Sof radiates before the tzim, after the tzimtzum, just like before the tzimtzum. But the impact that it does have, even Lamaila, you could say, is that when God said Yehi Oyer, he was not saying Yehi Rakia. Even though Yehi Oyer lies all the depth and everything, and the tzimtzum does not, but he's not saying Yehi Rakia. He wants there to be a distinction. That's basically what he added here in this parentheses, as far as the moshel and the nimshal go. Okay, I think I'll stop here, but let me stop for any questions.
I'm just trying to understand the last point you made, that there is an impact on the mitzel.
The mashpia.
Sorry, well, what's the difference here in that?
Well, he doesn't use that word, so I don't want to use the word he doesn't use.
Okay, but if we're talking about atzmus, I'm not coming to dispute, to argue about the word choice. I'm the substance here. I did not understand the impact, except unless you're saying the impact is that he's dafka, the Eibusher's dafka focusing on a tzimtzum. So it by force of, it's not just by force of logic, but b'metzias, in reality, by the Eibusher, the fact that he's focusing on the tzimtzum is an effect on him. Is that the point?
I wouldn't say effect. Let's use the example he's giving. The teacher, I gave the example of the teacher before he's teaching, and then when he's teaching. So let's say the student is listening in before he's teaching. You followed me before with that, right?
Yes.
So if the student is listening in, he won't be able to understand it. He'll become a vulbal. And
Yes.
the teacher himself also, as he's teaching the student, he's not bringing into his whole consciousness the whole gili, even though he is not affected by the tzimtzum, but he is distinguishing. Like I said, God, when he says Yehi Oyer, he's not saying Yehi Rakia. On day 1, he said Yehi Oyer, and light was created. On day 2, Yehi Rakia. So within it lies the full godliness without any concealment, but the concealment has the effect that there is that the inner premise is not mavalbal, is not overwhelming the chitzenius. So the kav, for example, even though it has, you can say, within the premise of it, it has all the area itself untouched, but as the kav is functioning like a kav that's spoon feeding, so to speak, and creating a structured existence.
Yes, that I understood all of that. I thought you said something about, and I'm reading the mushal here, but that when there is a tzimtzum, that the mashpia does feel an effect of it, but this seems to be not saying that. No.
What's the pu'ula? What is the purpose of the tzimtzum from the point of view of the mashpia? So till now he's speaking about the makabel. The makabel can't contain all that light. Now he's saying for the mashpia too that it's not involved. When he's sitting and learning on his own, it's not like when he's teaching. Anyway, I just suggest reading it over a few times. He says it clearly. Also, tzimtzum legaba mashpi hishapnimis ena mavatal ve'ena mavalbas achitzenis.
But he's talking. The point is that is
Okay.
Dafka. The point of the Tzimtzum is that he shouldn't upset or confuse the hashpa and the chitzonius. But it doesn't seem to be talking about what happens within Atzmus itself.
I don't know about atzmus. I wouldn't use the word atzmus, first of all, because he's not using atzmus here at all. He's using Erein Sof, just for the record. So I wouldn't even use the word atzmus here. Number one, just for accuracy purposes.
Yes.
Secondly, but the teacher, as I said, if he was, while he was teaching the student, everything that he knows would come out from his mouth, that would not work. So the Tzimtzum also is for him, to make sure that he doesn't overwhelm the idea that he wants to convey to the student.
I see. Okay, thank you. Now I get it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and he elaborates on that. If you want to look back on Shlesh Dvarim, back on page 1010, the previous volume 2, he elaborates more on that. Okay, we're going to stop here. Any other questions? Yeah. Okay. So we'll stop here. Top of page 1423.
Class rest of the week, regular time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I don't know if anybody wants New Year's, could be